When Americans go to the polls on Tuesday to elect a new president, they'll also be voting for members of Congress. Republicans hold a majority in both houses, but that could change. So how will a Trump or Clinton win affect the U.S. Congress and the country's ability to get things done? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Hazem Sika. It's been long, hard-fought, and at times downright nasty. But this U.S. presidential campaign is almost over, and Americans will finally have their say on who they want to be their next president when they head to the polls on Tuesday. Millions have already made that decision in states that allow early voting. And whether it's Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton who becomes the next president of the United States, how effectively they can do their job will depend a great deal on who has a majority in Congress. At the moment, the Senate has 44 Democrats, 54 Republicans, and 2 independents. The House of Representatives has 188 Democrats and 247 Republicans. As you can see, the Republicans currently enjoy a majority in both houses of Congress. But that could change on Election Day, and whatever the result, control of America's legislative body will be essential. Well, if the next president's own party has the majority in Congress, passing any legislation will be easier, but things could get very difficult if there's, say, a Democrat in the White House and the Republican majority continues in Congress. The next president will decide whether to keep President Obama's current nominee or appoint a new justice of the Supreme Court. The Republican-led Senate has so far refused to even hold hearings for Merrick Garland. Hillary Clinton says she will keep the Affordable Health Care Act and even expand parts of it, but Donald Trump wants to replace it with something else entirely. Whoever has a majority in Congress will have a big say in that. And there's debate over the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The controversial free trade agreement may not have a future under either candidate or their parties. Well, let's bring in our guests now to talk more about this. In New York, we have Jeannie Zaino, political scientist and professor of political science and international studies at Iona College. In Chicago, James Warren, a political columnist for U.S. News and World Report and former managing editor and Washington bureau chief for the Chicago Tribune. And joining us from London, James Boyce, U.S. political analyst and historian and the author of Hillary Rising. Good to have you all with us. Jeannie Zaino, if I could start with you then. What are the various, of all of the various scenarios here, what do you think is the most likely at this point, and how well does it bode for the United States and the world?
In terms of Congress, I think we're certainly looking for Republicans to hold the House. They have the House now by huge numbers. They will likely hold it. The big question in the House is how many seats do they lose, if they lose any, and also what is the future for the House Speaker, Paul Ryan. He's got a very difficult body there to try to hold together as we move into the next Congress. In the Senate, we're looking very, very tight. Democrats do have a chance to take over the Senate, but it is a very tight race right now. If they do, we're going to see a divided Congress, and depending on who wins the White House, we'll certainly see a divided government if that happens either way. So it doesn't bode particularly well when you're talking about policymaking, because it's going to be very difficult to work both across the natural division between Congress and the White House, let alone a partisan division, which we're likely to continue to see in Washington. All
right, if we take a scenario then, James Warren, where, say, Hillary Clinton becomes president, but with a Republican-controlled Congress, what do you think are the prospects for anything meaningful being done there, particularly given the divisiveness between parties at the moment there?
Minimal. I think that'd be one word to describe it. Excuse me for my voice, but Jeannie, nailed it. I think you'd have largely a repeat of what's played out in the last year or so. And for those who don't follow the U.S. Congress, these guys have not worked very hard. There are very few suffering from exhaustion as a result of their labor. They worked very few days this year. They got very little done. There is the possibility that, for example, if she would win and the Republicans would lose the U.S. Senate, which is unclear at this point, some of the very same conservative Republicans who have been grousing about lame duck sessions and wanting to do away with them might rush back to Washington to see if they could, I don't know, at least get a bridge or something, some money for something back in their congressional district. But for sure, nothing will happen in the lame duck session. There's been some theorizing about how President Obama's pretty solid selection for that 9th spot on the U.S. Supreme Court, Merrick Garland, might have some sort of chance if Hillary wins, because the Republicans would be nervous about a more left of center choice. I just don't think that's going to happen. I think many of the Republicans are going to say, well, what's so bad about only 8 people on the U.S. Supreme Court and not much getting done? And so I think, Garland is certainly not going to meet any success in the next few months.
James Boyes in London, how are people on the other side of the Atlantic going to be looking at this, and what implications does the makeup of the U.S. Congress have for it?
To be quite honest with you, I don't think many people in this country are giving the makeup of Congress a second thought whatsoever, if I'm very honest. Most people here are terrified at the thought of Donald Trump becoming president in its own right and don't fully understand the implications of how Congress works. It's a body of government which far too little thought is given to internationally, maybe even domestically, as both James and Jeannie were both saying. We're looking at probably a continuity there with regards to Republicans maintaining control, certainly of the House, probably of the Senate. I think it would take quite a push at this point for the Democrats to regain control of the Senate. So we're really looking at continued gridlock for at least the next 2 years, I would imagine. But as I often tell many of my students, the American system of government exists in such a way that Congress is not there to act as a rubber stamp for the president. It's designed to frustrate the passage of legislation, and certainly Congress has made a good job of doing that, of frustrating the presidency. And I think that if, as it seems at least, the three of us would agree that the likely outcome is a Hillary Clinton presidency with a Republican-controlled Congress, then I think we're up for at least another 2 years of continued gridlock in Washington, and of course potential congressional investigations into Hillary Clinton's past life.
James Warren, this has been called a campaign like no other in so many ways. But if there's any kind of historical perspective to draw from this, where, for example, you have a president of one party and a Congress from another, they have worked together in the past, haven't they?
Yeah, but Hazem, the reality is that when big things have gotten done legislatively in Congress, it's because the president has had huge majorities on his side. Some of the things, for instance, that Lyndon Johnson got done after the assassination of John Kennedy, major health matters and other things, the Voting Rights Act, that was all done because he had giant majorities. Now, some of them were then conservative Southern Democrats, who now, most of them are Republicans. But there's not much precedent for divided government winding up with a bunch of achievements. I mean, take something that has, totally soiled the American image overseas, namely the detainee camp at Guantanamo Bay. If you got divided government, not much is going to happen. Obama has, failed in his big campaign promise of closing it down. He has tried, with fairly systemic ways in the last couple of years to sort of drain the camp of many of the detainees. He let go 15, I think, in August to the United Arab Emirates. That means there are about 60 or so left. But they also include some detainees who even the Obama administration concede are too dangerous to let go. They include some folks who are charged with crimes in 9/11, and they're not going to let those folks go. So I think whatever happens when there's inauguration on January 20th of next year, whether it's Clinton or Trump, you're going to have that horrible stain on America of that detention camp still in place.
Jeannie Zaino, some prominent Republicans have already said that should Hillary Clinton become president and they retain control of Congress, they are essentially going to do everything they can to obstruct anything she does, and not only that, to launch investigations into her past, to block her nominees for the Supreme Court. I know we've touched on some of this already, but what questions does that raise for the institutions in the United States and the whole heart of American democracy?
It really is incredibly frustrating to watch, because part of the reason we're in the situation we are vis-a-vis the presidency in 2016 and this really difficult race we've all been watching is because Americans are so frustrated with the lack of any type of policy movement forward out of Washington, D.C. over the last decade or so. And that's why you see somebody like Donald Trump, who appeals to many Americans because he is an outsider, because he is running on this message of change, because he is anti-establishment, if you will. We saw the same thing on the Democratic side with the appeal of a Bernie Sanders, who famously wasn't even a Democrat until 3 weeks before the primaries started. And so you see that kind of attraction on the American public's part to these anti-establishment, anti-Washington folks, in large part because they're right. Nothing has gotten done of much note in Washington. And so, you know, you look at something like the horrific spate of shootings that we have throughout this country, almost unfortunately on a monthly or weekly basis. Something like Sandy Hook, where we saw 27 people, mostly children ages 5 to 7, murdered in their classroom. And most Americans agree that we need sensible gun control, and yet it has been years and that has stalled in Congress. And unfortunately, as you talk about the prospect of a Republican-controlled Senate and House next year and a potential Clinton presidency, you're likely to see more of the same. And what that suggests about American government going forward, unfortunately, is that people will be even more frustrated in 4 years than they are this time around. What we really do need is we need some real structural change. Part of the problem here is our political parties are very, very weak. You have in somebody like former Speaker John Boehner or current Speaker Paul Ryan, the leading Republican elected official in the country, who can't control his caucus and get anything of note done. You saw people like Marco Rubio on the Republican side try to work across the aisle with Democrats and pass fairly sensible immigration reform. They couldn't get it done. So until we have either some kind of strengthening of our parties or a lessening of the division between the executive and the congressional branches, you're going to see a lot more of this impasse where even sensible policy that most people agree to, like recently attempting to address the Zika virus, just completely is difficult to pass. And it's an incredible frustration for the American public. So I know the American public, particularly those who have supported Donald Trump, are looked at as you know, kind of oddly across the world as why would they support this person? But if you take a step back, they're really frustrated, and that's with good reason.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about the prospects of a Donald Trump presidency. And James Boyes, I know you touched on this a little bit earlier. That is, as you said, a prospect that horrifies many people outside of the United States, particularly in Europe, on the issues of NATO and what he said about Russia and President Putin. Why is that? Just explain that to us.
Well, I think there's always fear of the unknown. I think most people around the world would like to see some degree of experience in the White House. And of course, as Jeannie rightly points out, Donald Trump's entire appeal to the American people is the fact that he is not part of the establishment, and he is promising to be a clean broom, effectively, in Washington. Well, of course, the problem with that is that he's also bringing with him a number of assertions with regards to America's response to the rest of the world. He's made some rather remarkable statements with regards to nuclear proliferation. One of the problems with Donald Trump, of course, is that over the course of the last 6 to 12 months, he has made a variety of statements which are rather outlandish, and then when he's called upon it, he sort of walks them back and says, well, I was being facetious, I was being sarcastic, you shouldn't take me seriously. But guess what? When you are the presidential candidate, people take you seriously and take you at your word. So when he talks about NATO being out of date and then retracts that, when he talks about having great admiration for his friend Putin and then walks that back, it's very, very difficult for world leaders to know quite what to make of Donald Trump, where he stands on any one issue, because it appears to change from day to day. And so it's very, very difficult. You know, the world political scheme, much like the economic markets, likes a degree of certainty. And what it doesn't like is great potential upheaval. And of course, the extent to which one individual, in this case the president, can really change the system is potentially open for debate. Of course, over the last couple of weeks, he's been asking Hillary Clinton time and time again why she hasn't fixed things almost single-handedly over the last 30 years. And as she has been forced to point out, that simply is not how the American political system works. It takes compromise, it takes teamwork, it takes bipartisanship. And that, as we have been discussing, has been sorely lacking in Washington now for far too long.
James Warren, I mean, James Boyce talks there about one of the big reasons why Donald Trump appeals to many people is his anti-establishment credentials, because there is a lot of anger in the United States right now at the political establishment, the political elite, if you will. Is there historical precedent for this, and how does that compare to what we're seeing now?
Sure. I mean, there's lots of historical precedent. I mean, we've had rage. I mean, you had third-party candidacies by the like of Ross Perot, if you remember, in just about 25 years ago. So yeah, I mean, and we've seen it in lots of other countries. But here, to be this close to having a man so seemingly unfit for the job, so cavalier about some of the major issues, so given to outright deceits and cheating, who's almost every day in an American newspaper or an American television network, there's more evidence of what's been rather feverish fact-checking, revealing Trump to have dissembled. And to have somebody here now on the precipice of this election, really within less than shouting distance of the White House, is quite incredible. And if you consume the polls as much as we do, and I'm sure as much as somebody like Jeannie does, you'd be scratching your head right now, because there are dramatic variances, and you've got lots of professional pollsters and survey folks who are sort of arguing in various journals and various digital news sites about why this is, what are the differing methodologies. But there's a seeming consensus that Trump is narrowing a Clinton lead. There's a seeming consensus that in places the Democrats thought they had lock-cinch U.S. Senate victories, places like Wisconsin, which is near where I'm talking to you, and the state of New Hampshire, that things may be changing in a different way. So yes, though there is lots of worldwide precedent for angry populists to vent and to put somebody. I mean, we've had actors. We had Arnold Schwarzenegger, the actor, would you believe it? Ended up being governor of our largest state, and you see folks in be it Latin America or Asia of a similar sort. But this will be such a shock to the body politic because of the seeming near absolute lack of competence and the cavalier way he has run this campaign. It would be rather stunning, and left to political scientists and historians like my colleagues here to decide 5 or 10 years down the road, was this all about Trump, or was this about just somebody being a vehicle for all of this frustration?
Jeannie Zaino, let's pick up on some of that, because there is this school of thought that says that the polls don't accurately reflect the support that Donald Trump has, because many people may be embarrassed to say that they support him. So what they will tell a pollster is something entirely different from when they get into that voting booth and they make that decision. Do you think there is any truth to that?
Yeah, in social science, we talk about that as a spiral of silence, and it's a big question mark, and we won't know until Tuesday of next week when voting occurs if that's the case. But you're absolutely right. When you talk about a spiral of silence, the idea is that when a pollster calls somebody, that person is reluctant to say something that's not socially acceptable. So if you call, a woman and ask her if she's going to vote for Donald Trump, she may feel like she's, being anti-feminist to say she is, but indeed go into the voting booth and pull the lever. We've also heard of husbands who are reluctant to admit to their wives, so they won't tell them in front of a pollster. They won't tell a pollster in front of their wives that they're going to vote for Donald Trump. I don't know if we're going to see a significant number of that, significant amount enough to change, but it's certainly a possibility. And just to pick up on what James was saying, we have a long history of these kinds of populist runs in this country. You can go way back and you see numerous populist appeals. What's different now and different today is, number one, the party has lost complete control over its own nominating process. And so Republicans ended up with somebody who his whole life was a Democrat and an independent and famously anti the party itself as their nominee. And they certainly are not happy about that, because After 1972, they lost control of their own process as we moved to primaries and caucuses. And the other thing that's happened is the advent of new technology. And as we all know, Donald Trump, with his money, but also with his use of social media, has been able to appeal to voters right over the heads of political parties and, quite frankly, right over the heads of most hardworking journalists. And so he has gone on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook and Snapchat, and he has made his appeal directly to the American public. That's something that populists, 20, 30 years ago or more didn't have the potential to do. And so that has changed things an enormous amount. And unfortunately, I think we're probably going to see echoes of this as we move forward. In other words, more people like Donald Trump who are able to appeal around the political parties and over the heads of media outlets as they make these kinds of runs. And I think that's going to happen unless the political parties can get control of their process again. And that's something that I think is, not going to be incredibly exciting to watch. But I do think we're going to see a number of rule changes, particularly on the Republican side, after this election is over. Because unfortunately for Republicans, they cannot, by their own admission after 2012, win a national race in this country if they don't appeal to Hispanics, Latinos, women, and millennials. And they have in Donald Trump a nominee who has managed to offend all of those groups and more almost repeatedly. And for that reason, it's unlikely he captures this thing, although, as both James and James said, it is still a possibility because the blue wall that the Democrats have in the Electoral College is breaking down a little bit in places like New Hampshire. If he runs the table on the swing states on Tuesday and picks up one or two of those states that we know are blue, he can actually take this thing.
James Boyce, when we compare the U.S. Congress to the way the legislative bodies work in other countries where you have this parliamentary system, the party that wins parliament basically controls the government, but Americans believe that their system is better because the Congress acts as a necessary check on executive power. But do you think we're seeing increasingly how that is working against anything meaningful being done in the U.S. government?
It's important to recognise that even here in Westminster, the legislature still acts as a brake upon the executive. It's certainly not a guarantee that whatever the government of the day wants to get through is guaranteed to pass. We've also got the judicial branch here as well, and we've seen just this week, for example, how the judiciary has really slapped down Theresa May's efforts with regards to moving forward on Brexit. So we have the checks and the balances here in London as well, it must be said. With regard to the US model, it's far too simplistic to say, oh, well, because there's been, gridlock of late, the system isn't working. I would point out that okay, we've seen rather excessive demonstrations of this, but if you look at how the American system of government is formulated and structured, it's working exactly as it's meant to operate. The American president is meant to basically, preside. The American legislature is there to basically offer advice and consent, but it's certainly not there to act as a mere rubber stamp. And it must be pointed out also, certainly here in Europe, it's often presented as good president, evil, bad-minded, introverted, often Republican Congress. Well, of course, we've seen in the past even when you've had a Democrat in control of the White House and the Senate and the House, as Bill Clinton had, for example, in his first 2 years, it's no guarantee you're going to get anything passed. Hillary Clinton was put in charge of the healthcare reform process in 1993 by her husband, and even with Democrats controlling both houses of Congress, she couldn't even steer that out of the committee stage. So, the system is in place. It's been in place for 240 years. There are challenges, but what it requires is strong congressional liaison from the White House. And I think that's one of the great failings, which is often underestimated by the Obama administration. It's poor congressional liaison from day one, effectively, with Congress. Admittedly, the Republicans did everything they could to prevent anything meaningful from happening, but you've got to have compromise on both sides. And for Barack Obama to come into the office as he did in 2008-9 and basically say, according to Bob Woodward, look, we won, you lost, and there's a price to pay for that, is not how you wax the tracks and get things done. So,
right.
Whether that's going to be any better under Hillary Clinton is doubtful, it must be said, though.
Well, we will wait and see. We are 3 days away from Election Day, and on that note, we're going to leave it. Thanks very much for being with us, Jeannie Zaino, James Warren, and James Boyce. Thanks very much for being on Inside Story. And thank you for watching. As always, you can see this program again anytime by visiting our website at jazeera.com. And for further discussion, you can go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle there is @AJ Inside Story. For me, Hazem, Sika, and the whole team here, bye for now.